Hey, my friends, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And if you have jumped in today or yesterday, you're getting an odd and different tone for how we usually have the conversation here. We're doing a daily 10, 12, 13-minute walkthrough of the book of Matthew, one little chunk at a time. And usually it's, fun. Like we goof around with it a little bit. But the last couple of conversations have us in a place where we're processing a very human experience that whether you've experienced it yet or not, you will at some point in life. Part of life is loss, is death. And here we are in Matthew chapter 14, watching the incarnate Christ deal with and process the blow of losing somebody who was very important to him. And it's tough to talk about something like that without hearkening back to our own experiences with loss, to be in that moment. It seems like we spend so much of life intentionally trying not to be in that moment. Especially from 1900 on, culture has done everything it can to distance itself from the realities of death. Even the way we treat the remains of the dead indicate that in the Western world, we're really trying to put a buffer between us and thinking about that moment that we know is coming, that thing that represents the human end to ultimately all of our relationships. And so, to you, new listener, thank you for jumping in, and thank you also for being willing to jump into the middle of a portion of our ongoing conversation here that is very, very serious. So yesterday we talked about something that has come up from time to time in the ongoing course of our discussion here, and that is the very formative moment for me that was the loss of my little brother. And I think we talked about this as well a few chapters back when we were looking at how Jesus responded to needing his own space and dealing with hurt and pain and his compassion for the lost, those who are harried and helpless like sheep without a shepherd, how that compassion overrules in his hierarchy of needs his need to be allowed to grieve and be alone and to process his own stuff. He can't help but look at the people made in the image of God who are grappling with life and in need of the life that he has to offer. He can't help but offer them compassion and meet their needs and care about where they're at, prioritizing them over his own stuff. I mean, the Son of Man, it's almost as though he didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So my dad, who I think is a pretty dang good guy, obviously went through the process of grief a little differently than I did with the loss of my brother all those years ago. And I remember coming down from Montana to northern Colorado, where my family's been from since forever. And you know how it is when somebody dies, you bawl and fall apart all over again each time you encounter another person who's also feeling the loss. It's like you need to have that emotional collapse with each of them as you grieve not just the loss of the person you loved, but as you also grieve the triangular relationship between you, the other grieving person, and the person who's lost. So I got down to Colorado. Everybody's doing the shared grieving thing. You cry anew a bajillion times over. I did that with my mom and my dad, hardest of all. And I got there pretty quickly after the accident. The accident was very high profile. The kid who was driving the car was my brother's friend, and that kid had had his license for 10 minutes. My brother took him to get his license in Greeley, Colorado, and the kid made a mistake, ran a giant stop sign into multiple lanes of highway speed traffic. And my brother's car that his buddy was driving got T-boned by an 18-wheeler. And as I've said, now the truck driver survived, but none of the kids in the car survived. And so that's pretty newsworthy, and it rocks a community, and the newspaper and the journalist types were really wanting to run stories about it. And there were people who were willing to run interference for my dad, but he was like, nope, let him come. And so people came to our house, not entirely with permission either. And we're doing the grieving thing. People are bringing food over. You can picture the scene. And it's like everybody showed up at once, like in a movie. And they got cameras and lights and all of this. And I remember Dad just walked right out the front door, and he's crying while he did it. But he wanted to go out there and talk about Christian faith, talk about Mark, my little brother's Christian faith. He wanted to talk about hope and optimism and meaning in this life. And that's what he did. he felt compassion toward whoever might be on the other end of that news story, of that camera. And so he did it, even though, of course, his natural instinct was to retreat and just cry. He wanted to shut the thing down. He's broken over what happened. But in imitation of the guy we're reading about here in Matthew chapter 14, just the way my dad's wired, he just couldn't help but be willing to set aside his own need to process and grieve in order to show compassion to others. And that's what we get in Matthew chapter 14. After the illegal, immoral, travesty, sham of justice execution of John the Baptist at the hands of Herod Antipas and his, well, at least biblically, illegitimate wife Herodias, the shockwave of grief passes through John's disciples. And in Matthew 14:12, they go and tell Jesus. It says, John's disciples came and took his body and buried it. Then they went and told Jesus. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. We can tell from the corresponding passage over in Luke that this withdrawal was one that went across tetrarchy lines. Jesus moved out of the territory governed by Herod Antipas, which I believe would barely include Capernaum. I should have looked that up, but I'm pretty sure Capernaum was barely under that jurisdiction. And by moving just a little bit to the east on the Sea of Galilee, he would cross over into the territory of Philip the Tetrarch, who controlled that space and who I suppose would have had less reason to be angry at Jesus or to even care what was going on with Jesus or John the Baptist or any of it. And this is another one of those places where the Herod family tree and having a sense of it is really important to understanding the larger story. This Philip, who sometimes gets called Herod Philip, but really should just be known as Philip the Tetrarch, is not the same Herod Philip who was the prince of Judea, who was married to Herodias, who had his wife stolen by Herod Antipas. This Philip, sometimes called Herod Philip, but I don't even think that's really was ever his name. It's just an attempt to keep it straight. This Philip the Tetrarch actually ended up marrying Herodias and Herod Philip's kid, Salome, who was the dancer at the John the Baptist beheading party. So it's very convoluted and very tricky, but what that means is that if Jesus, according to Luke, withdrew to the territory of Philip the Tetrarch, he did so because he would have believed that the Tetrarch just wasn't concerned with these affairs very much, and maybe there was less threat about John the Baptist or Jesus or anything there. Whatever the case, Jesus bails out over to this place, but it's not really that far away, just a couple miles from Jesus' base of operations in Capernaum, which enough time had elapsed between Jesus being not accepted in Nazareth and what went on here with Herod Antipas, that in that interim, Jesus has made his way back to Capernaum. Otherwise, it makes no sense that he would retreat by boat. Clearly, we're back in Capernaum. There'd be nowhere to retreat by boat if you were in Nazareth. So we're back at the Sea of Galilee. Jesus, again, takes this little bit of time away from people, but people aren't having it. I mean, it's a giant lake. It's flat. You can see where Jesus is going in the boat. And so other people on foot just look at where the boat is, and they're like, that guy can do miracles and solve my family's problems, solve my illnesses. I'm not letting him out of my sight. And so they track him down without any concern for what he's actually going through. And so then Matthew 14:14, it says, when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, you would expect something like he sent his disciples out to be like, dude, have some respect, people. Come on, give us 5 minutes. Just think about what he's going through. Come back next week. But he doesn't do that. He doesn't do that at all. His immediate response is that he has compassion on them and healed their sick. Mark and Luke communicate that there was teaching as well. So what that means is rather than getting mad and running everybody off and just being like, I just can't do it. I don't have the emotional clarity or fortitude right now. I just need to be alone, which would have been reasonable. Instead of doing that, he gets up in the pulpit and gets right back to the thing that John the Baptist would have wanted him to talk about. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. He gets right up and talks about the thing that he believes can give them life and that ultimately one day can defeat the things, those being death and sin, that created this deeply emotional, hurtful incident that he's trying to process right now. So he just gets up and he talks about that stuff and he takes care of people's needs, and he doesn't do it while at all being grouchy. And what's crazy and what is often forgotten is that it is under these circumstances that we pivot into a spontaneous moment in the narrative where all these people have gathered and they didn't plan ahead. They saw Jesus going away and they're like, well, no, I need him. I still haven't had my conversation with him. I still need to be healed. I still need to understand what he's talking about. Spontaneously, it looks like people just drop what they're doing and follow him along the Sea of Galilee. And now they're a long ways from home and they're all hungry. And this, though the context is often forgotten, is how we get into the story of the feeding of the multitude, which of course we'll get to very soon. I will never forget what it felt like to get home from Montana to my grieving family, to do all of that crying over the loss of my brother, then to have all those people show up in the front yard. There were some people grieving at my house who referred to them as vultures, literally that word in that moment. And before anybody could talk about what our strategy would be to deal with it or what we were going to do, my dad just walked out with lights already on him and answered every question and talked to people with patience and grace without any concern for what he needed in the moment. That gives me the tiniest little sense of what this moment must have looked like to the disciples and the people who were close enough to Jesus to know what had just happened, to know what he was going through, and in that moment, under that pressure, to realize, without any further question or debate, what his actual goals were, what his actual priorities were. It was and it is a very telling moment. Thanks for processing this somber scene with me over the last couple of days. Tomorrow we will get on to more of an overview thing. We'll joke around about stuff more and it'll be fun. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.